Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. Welcome to today's webinar focusing on climate change in the Middle East and North Africa. My name is Tamara Kharoub. I'm the Deputy Executive Director at Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and a Senior Fellow here. I am pleased to welcome you all to this important event today titled Climate Change and Environmental Injustice in MENA, Challenges and Pathways Forward, which we are very pleased to be co-organizing with the MENA program at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI. If you have been following our work at Arab Center, Washington, D.C., you probably know that we have dedicated most of our activities since October 7th to addressing the war in Gaza and its impact and implications, which continues to be a critical issue in the region, not only as a humanitarian catastrophe for Palestinians in Gaza, but also for the future of the region as a whole and the future of peace efforts and the international rule-based order. While it's important to maintain our focus on the urgent and extreme nature of the war and its consequences, we also must continue addressing other important and pressing issues affecting the region today, such as the climate emergency. The climate crisis has been described as the greatest challenge and existential threat that humanity has ever faced. The Middle East and North Africa region, in particular, is among the most vulnerable to climate change, with temperatures rising twice as fast as the global average, and the region being the most water scarce and food import dependent in the world. Across the region today, we see extreme weather, floods, record drought, forest fires, and land degradation, which have further threatened food and water insecurity, triggered mass displacement, intensified conflicts and environmental politics, and contributed to the rise of poverty, among many other impacts. As the MENA region today faces unprecedented multidimensional crises, compounded by being a climate impact hotspot, we decided to organize this important webinar to discuss the unique climate challenges in MENA countries, examine adaptation and mitigation strategies, and outline opportunities and pathways forward in the region. The issue of climate change and environmental injustice is one of our thematic priorities here at Arab Center, Washington, D.C., as we focus in our work on providing justice-based approaches to research and policy analysis. And we are especially happy to be organizing this webinar jointly with the MENA program at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. I am pleased that we have this partnership, and I would like to thank Ala Tartir, the director of the program at SIPRI, for his efforts in making this happen. And I would also like to thank my colleague, Lana Qattan, who leads partnerships at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. We look forward to further cooperation with SIPRI on similar important issues in the future. For the discussion today, we are very fortunate to have with us an excellent lineup of experts to whom we are grateful for their time and contributions. I very much look forward to listening to their insights. But first, please allow me to introduce Ala Tartir from SIPRI, who will in turn introduce the panelists and share the discussion. Ala is a senior researcher and the director of the Middle East and North Africa program at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Ala is also a research associate at the Geneva Graduate Institute Center on Conflict, Development, and Peacebuilding. He is a global fellow at the Peace Research Institute Oslo, a policy advisor to Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network, and a governing board member of the Arab Reform Initiative. Ala, thank you for working with us on organizing this event and for chairing the session today. And now I will turn it over to Ala to lead the discussion. Ala, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tamara, for the introduction. And it's really a pleasure to partner in organizing this panel and seminar between SIPRI and the Arab Center in DC. And we look forward to having a very comprehensive conversation over the next 1.5 hours, as we have 4 distinguished speakers with us today, whom I would like to thank very much. and also through the questions that we will receive from the audience that we will have. Just as a reminder that this is a recorded session and it will be made available after the panel today. And we will be discussing, as Tamara mentioned, climate change and environmental injustice in the MENA region, looking at the challenges and pathways forwards. For that, we have 4 distinguished speakers to take us in different areas and different domains and different geographical focuses, but also looking at the issue through different analytical lenses. Each panelist will have around 10 to 12 minutes to present and put their interventions. And then after that, we will have a discussion and a conversation and address a number of questions that we will have within the time frame that we will have. So in terms of the order of the panel, we will start with Karim El-Gindi, who is Associate Fellow at Chatham House. And Karim will discuss issues related to energy transition, COP28, and climate impact in the region. And from Karim, we will move to Nida Dawahri, who is a professor at the Department of Political Science at Cleveland State University. And Nida will focus on Jordan and Syria, in particular through the impact of climate change and on water and agriculture. Then we will move to Muna Dajani, who is a fellow in environment at the Department of Geography and Environment at LSE, London School of Economics. And Muna will also look at water and environmental injustice and hydropolitics in the region, including Palestine, Jordan, and the Golan Heights. And finally, we'll move to Aisha Srehi, who is a research fellow at the National University of Singapore Middle East Institute. With that, please, dear audience, feel free to send your questions using the Q&A function at any time you would like. And also feel free to send your questions through the email address of events@arabcenterdc.org, and we will receive also the questions if you send them to that email address. And with that, Karim, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ala, and thanks to the Arab Center DC and CIPRI for the invitation and for inviting me to take part in this conversation about climate change and environmental injustice. As a matter of fact, I really like the fact that you focus on environmental injustice, and would like to take that as an opportunity to highlight that I believe quite firmly that the greatest injustice in the world is an environmental injustice. We as humans, collectively, all of us have effectively destroyed and pillaged the natural world, all in the name of economic growth and capitalism, unsustainable capitalism. And all impacts on the environment have been really considered externalities outside of our calculations. These shared natural elements, what we call the global commons, have largely been ignored to date. Another injustice that we also have is how unfairly we distribute the loot, if you like. And more to our subject is the additional injustice I would like to focus on is how impacts of climate change caused by this economic growth have been unevenly distributed. And I would argue to you that the Middle East and North Africa region have been disproportionately affected by climate change. And when I say disproportionately, I mean disproportionately to the region's share of global population, disproportionately to the region's share of the global GDP and global economy, and far more than the region's own responsibility for this climate change. The historical emissions from this region do not justify, or far less disproportionately to the impacts that the region is going to experience. But the region also is a region that needs to wean itself of fossil fuels. As the world is being restructured, these climate negotiations are nothing short of a remaking of the global economy. As this is happening, the region also needs to wean itself of fossil fuels and find a way in which it can become part of the rule-making of this new global economy rather than a rule taker, as this new economy is currently being forged. And so where does that leave us in terms of energy transition? I think conventionally the region found itself in a situation that I will have to explain a little bit of the context for. Carbon emissions have historically, conventionally, been attributed to where they are burned. So in other words, if I did buy a piece of wood and turn it into furniture, then there are no emissions, and I'm not at blame in any way. But if I buy a piece of wood and burn it, then there are emissions, and the emissions are on me. They're not on the person who sold me the piece of wood. And likewise, if I buy a barrel of oil and I choose to turn it into plastics, there are no emissions. If I choose to burn it, then the emissions are on me and not on the person that sold me that barrel of oil. But more recently, we had seen more commitments, rising commitments to phase out fossil fuels. And specifically, the success had been on unabated coal, and some of the effort has been done on fossil fuel subsidies, which also contribute to that. And there's this additional pressure to consider this phase out has led to focus on both the buyers and the sellers, if you like, the consumers and the producers of fossil fuels. And there was certainly an impact on this region as a result of that, because the region, part of it obviously has a major oil exporting industry, and that certainly is affected by this. But for the parts of the region that are not dependent on that, this focus on energy transition, this focus on moving away from fossil fuels, has encouraged them to accelerate their move away. All they needed was a little bit of funding, and hopefully that will be forthcoming. But countries such as Morocco and Jordan and Egypt have certainly made some positive movements as a result of this incentive to transition away from fossil fuels. But also the Gulf countries, which had been reliant on fossil fuel exports to drive their economies, found themselves in a bit of a conundrum. They normally use oil and gas revenues to run their economy, but now they're using these oil and gas revenues to fund this decarbonization, which has caused a little bit of a controversy, simply because they're using those revenues, those fossil fuel revenues, to move away from fossil fuels. So in a way, they find themselves in the situation where if the decarbonization process or this transformation to their economies stops halfway, and they can't export, then they're neither here nor there. So what they did do is they adopt this dual approach where they're investing in renewables internally, making sure that they're moving away their energy systems, for example, from fossil fuels, but at the same time continue to export every drop of oil and gas that they can sell to the rest of the world. And their argument is that their oil and gas is the cheapest in the world. It's also the lowest in terms of carbon footprint per barrel, per unit of energy. And they also developed this new framework for moving away from fossil fuels or decarbonization in general that focuses on continuing to use some of these energy systems, these fossil fuels, but relying more on carbon or capturing carbon, offsetting carbon, and perhaps some emission trading systems where carbon becomes more of a managed issue rather than dealing with the energy source that produces carbon in the first place. And we saw that in full display ahead of COP28. There was intense pressure to phase out fossil fuel, phase down fossil fuel, whatever the language that was used at the time. And there was different meanings to those terms in the negotiation circles. And in the end, what we did see was a quote-unquote historic agreement to transition away from fossil fuel. This is that term is deemed as slightly lighter. There were also some loopholes, arguably, that meant that might not happen at all. But the idea that there's momentum to move away from fossil fuels globally, and that Dubai and the UAE and the region has been a conduit to this happening was certainly meaningful. There are other things that happened at COP28 that also got a lot of attention, namely the loss and damage fund and the fact that the region has managed, the UAE, the host, and other European nations have managed to cobble together 700 million as some form of compensation, although that term is never used, to help those countries that are affected by climate change but cannot adapt to it. There's also some movement on food systems as well. And there were some pledges. So these are not negotiated outcomes. There's not something that 200 countries agreed on, and they're not in the text. But the fact that all the countries are there is an opportunity for them to agree on things. So there was an agreement by 130 countries or so that the renewables will triple by 2030, and the energy efficiency development rate will double also by the same year. There were coalitions around cooling to becoming net zero, or collaboration on nuclear energy, and also more momentum on phasing out coal and methane and reducing methane. But also COP27 and COP28, the fact that they were in the region, kind of spotlighted the impacts of climate change, those cascading impacts of climate change on the region. The region is certainly at risk from climate change. Some of the more significant impacts are economic in nature. So the sectors such as agriculture and tourism will certainly be impacted. And there are also some concerns about the livability of some parts of the region. And this livability issue is perhaps something that we need to look at more closely. The science is still very early on, but there is a risk that some parts of the region will not be livable. And as a result, this raises issues to do with climate-induced migration. And in the context of this region, the combination of conflict and climate change is what makes the risk of climate-induced migration the most critical. And generally speaking, climate change is deemed to cause migration. There's no doubt upon this. The estimates are very widely. There's estimates from 25 million people, 225 million people, migrants by 2050, to up to 1 billion, and I've heard even higher. But on average, the number that gets cited most is 200 million by 2050. And these could be as a result of a sudden climate event, like a flooding, for example, or a storm. And they can also be as a result of slow events. And these could be like sea level rise, or desertification, or scarcity in water. And because the region is partly in the temperate zone, but also partly in warmer areas or tropical areas, subtropical areas, we find that it's at risk of the slow shifting of the habitable zone in the world. So it's expected that as a result of climate change, the area in which humans would live, the more temperate parts of the world, will shift northwards, at least in the northern hemisphere. And this would mean that from 14 to 21% of the global population, somewhere in the region of 1.3 to 1.6 billion people, will find themselves outside of the habitable zone. And these areas that used to be temperate areas, in terms of climate, will no longer be temperate. And they will need to move northwards, presumably. Also, the region is quite coastal. About half of the population lives within 100 kilometers of the coast, and sea level rise is specifically at risk, especially in low income areas that can hardly adapt to sea level rise and other coastal risks. But climate change will also have impacts on this region because of its impact on conflict, or its relationship with conflicts, and the way the two of them interact to exacerbate the risks that could lead to climate migrants is also noteworthy. Climate change will inevitably impact economic conditions, which could lead to political tensions, could lead to social discontent. In some contexts, this has led to conflict, perhaps in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, between farmers and pastoralists. In the Middle East and North Africa, this hasn't quite manifested itself, but there is certainly a risk. Then one could say that there is a correlation between conflict and climate impacts, but no causation as yet. So there's the example of Syria, where there was a massive drought that could have contributed to the uprising in Syria in 2011. It always comes to mind, but it's certainly no causation there that has been established beyond doubt. But when conflicts do happen, what it does do is securitize the infrastructure that could make a population resilient to climate change. And on top of that, we have this issue we have this additional intersection where 95% of displacement that happened in 2020 happened in countries that are already vulnerable to climate change. So these intersections between conflict and climate change will certainly exacerbate the risk of climate migration. And the region is in no way ready to deal with neither the economic impacts of climate change on it, and the potentially ensuing conflicts, or any large-scale migration that can occur as a result. And the global system that struggles with far less migration is not prepared and doesn't have the mechanisms to deal with large-scale displacement at the scale of 200 million within a couple of decades. So to end this, and I hope I haven't exceeded my time, climate change is the largest environmental crisis that we have, and certainly part of this incredible environmental injustice that the world is currently experiencing. But if we don't act, it could also become a humanitarian crisis.
Thank you very much, Karim, for all these thoughts and ideas and arguments that you put forward. I know we will come back to a number of them, including the nexus between the climate change and conflict and migration. And I know that Aisha will come in her intervention and reflect on what climate change means in particular for the Gulf region, and linking with one of your earlier points you highlighted, Karim. But now I would like to move to Nida. Over to you, Nida, to focus more on Jordan and Syria through the impacts of climate change on water and agriculture. And I know you have slides that they are showing nicely. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Ala, and thank you, Karim and Tamara. So I'm going to build on what a lot has already been said to give you an overview of the impact of climate change on water insecurity in the Middle East, with a focus on Syria and Jordan. Let me see if this is going. Okay, as has been already mentioned, so the Middle East at its baseline is an arid and semi-arid region. It's one of the driest regions in the world, and it's like countries like Jordan, for example, are 97% arid, dry. Iraq is 97%, so a very small percentage of the area is actually has enough water for the agricultural sector. If you look at the world's most water scarce states, out of the top 17, 14 are located in the Middle East. So the baseline, we have a very dry area. Now, on top of that, we have a high population growth rate. So in 2018, the population was 450 million. By 2050, it's expected to increase by 720 million. So there's an increasing demand on a very limited supply of water. Another important statistic is that 90% of the region's children live in areas of high water stress. This is a big problem because this is the human capital for the region. These children will be the future economic engines for the region, and they're growing up in an environment that they're confronting water insecurity. And also, as I will show you, the Middle East has a water quality crisis. Now, the highest population growth rates are being experienced in areas that are affected by conflict, such as Iraq, Palestine, and Yemen, and we'll talk about Syria also. Now, the baseline is dry, increasing demand, and enter climate change. So it's not climate change by itself, it's climate change entering an environment that's already dry. And the other thing I want to propose to you, we have all these wonderful models that tell us what's going to happen in the future. In fact, this is already happening in the Middle East. It has been happening for the past 50 years in the Middle East. The region is getting hotter, the region is getting drier, the precipitation is not coming as it used to be. So if we look at the past, we can see the patterns. The policymakers have been noticing the shift in the transition in the environment, but it's only recently that they have the words and the data to support it. So as we heard earlier today, the IPCC classifies the region as a hotspot for the impact of climate change. And it says that the Middle East it requires more adaptive capacity out of the Middle East to survive climate change than any other region in the world. So let's look at what the models tell us. In the future, the temperature is going to get hotter, between 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. What the data tells us, it is already increased by 1 degree. Models tell us precipitation is going to decrease, and it's going to vary seasonally. what we are experiencing in the Middle East is already a variation in the precipitation pattern that has historically been the pattern in the region. So what is happening is the rains are coming late and they're ending early. And when the rains do come, they come very, very fast. The problem this produces is that it stunts the growth of crops, leads to the failure of crops, and it minimizes and prevents the capacity for the aquifers to refill, to replenish the aquifers, because the rains are not coming at a slower pace. The models also tell us we're going to have more, we're going to experience more frequent and prolonged droughts. The region is already experiencing more frequent and prolonged droughts. We have been in a drought since 2020, and this last growing season was also a drought season. The models tell us we're going to have 20% decrease in water supply. We're already seeing a decrease in water supply across the Middle East. Dust storms are already happening. Desertification, this is a very serious problem for the Middle East. The little amount of land that it does have, that it is using to meet some livelihood for the urban and also the rural areas, some jobs to keep people in the villages, that is turning into desert. And unless we are able to protect the fertile land, this is going to create a big problem for the Middle East. For example, let's talk about grasslands in Syria, in the southwestern or southeastern part of the territory. There's an area called the steppe area that is inhabited by mostly Bedouins and pastoralists. The grass that they depend on to feed their sheep and their cattle and their herds, that grass has dried out. It has turned into desert. So they are moving into the farming area. And we're starting to see tension, for example, in northeastern Syria between the pastoralists and the sedentary farmers that, depend on the land. The other thing that's occurring is heat waves. It is already occurring. The problem with heat waves is an economic issue. As Karim was telling us, rich people turn on their air conditioning. What happens to poor people? What happens to villagers? What happened to the farmers that are trying to survive off of the land? And what happens to the refugees that don't have access to enough electricity in conflict-affected areas to survive through the heats? So climate change coming into an area that's already arid is going to challenge the region's water security, as I proposed, food security, as we already see in Syria. If the country is dependent on generating hydropower from its rivers, its capacity to meet its energy security will decrease, as happened to Syria. Syria lost 50% of its energy production because the dams did not have enough water to even above the dead storage capacity to generate electricity. And for farmers, especially poorer farmers, when you have consecutive drought, one after the other, they have no time to recover from the previous season to survive the second season. So the livelihood of people depending on the land is also being threatened. On top of all of this, it is really critical to note that the region has a mismanagement problem. Whatever water they have not managed it sufficiently. So here I'll end with a lot of ways that the region can improve its management of the precious water that it has. We have overexploitation of groundwater, contamination of river. This is brought about by war. The war in Syria, they targeted the agriculture sector. They went after irrigation canals. They went after the municipal sector's water supply, and it is absolutely devastated. So what happens to the agriculture? It runs off into the river. What happens to the wastewater treatment plants? They've already been destroyed by war. So wastewater goes into the river. So we have contaminated the river because of war. We have also contaminated it because of overuse of water. In southeastern Turkey, the area around the Euphrates River, while Turkey delivers clean water into Syria in the main branch of the Euphrates River, it does not do so in a tributary where it delivers irrigation runoff that mixes with the all the waste that is a byproduct of war. So when Iraq complains of dirty water, believe them, the water is contaminated as it enters Iraq. So the agriculture sector consumes between 50 to 85% of the domestic water supply. There's tremendous opportunities for efficiencies here. We cannot stop agriculture. Agriculture is an important contributor to food security, to livelihood, to the urban poor. And the rural poor. So transboundary rivers. The region depends on 60% of its water supply is transboundary. And those rivers are the Euphrates, Tigris, Jordan, and Asi. This presents a huge problem because upstream development does impact downstream development. So let's look at the Euphrates and Tigris River. Historically, Iraq was the first country to develop the river. Poor Iraq now is the last country to get whatever drop of water comes downstream. Turkey started developing the Euphrates and Tigris rivers beginning in the 60s, taking off in the 70s. It wanted to generate hydropower because it's short of electricity. As a result, its plan is to build 22 dams. It has built 18 dams. And what happens is that it consumes it for hydropower and agriculture. Agriculture is actually consumption. So this whole area has become an agriculture center for rice, for wheat, for all kinds of cotton that's exported into the United States. But this is also the breadbasket right here in Hasaka for Syria. And this is an agriculture area for Iraq. So what has happened in times of drought, I will show you some satellite pictures. In times of drought, Turkey can use its hydrological infrastructure to protect its water consumption and its allocation to the agriculture sector, while downstream Syria and Iraq suffer. In the most recent drought, 73% decline in the Euphrates River as it enters Iraq. And so I'll show you images in one moment, but we have two protocols over the Euphrates River, one between Turkey and Syria, committing Turkey to discharge 500 cubic meters per second. For Iraq and Syria, at Jarablus. Jarablus is a water measuring station right here as the Euphrates enters Syria. 58% of that water goes to Iraq and 42% stays. So we have these two agreements, but we also have droughts and we have increased upstream consumption of water inside of Turkey. So this is a satellite image of the drought in 2021. As you can see, the darker the color of red, the drier the area. This is southeastern Turkey, this is northeastern Syria, and this is Iraq. All right. So you can see it was a severe drought. And look at the picture now. Turkey was able, this is a satellite image in April 2021, from the United States, and the orange means it is healthy vegetation. We can't tell what crop it is, but we can tell it's healthy vegetation. And then you can see here, there was 90% failure in the wheat crop in Hasaka. Hasaka is Syria's breadbasket. It is, predominantly dependent on rainwater that didn't come, and then the Euphrates shrunk, and there was an absolute water insecurity here. In fact, the Euphrates shrunk by 5 meters. I'll tell you more about, if you're interested, about the dams in Syria. The dam was like 1 meter away from dead storage capacity. And if it reaches dead storage capacity, then the turbines will fail and collapse and break. And Syria is not allowed to, because of the sanction, bring in the parts to repair the turbines. So that means that electricity for 50% of the population will cease to exist. And then you can see crop failure in Iraq. So let's look at Syria a little bit more, because it is a conflict-affected area. Its water insecurity, is a byproduct of conflict, war, but also upstream consumption and climate change and mismanagement. 50% of the population lacks access to water. People were so desperate for water that they just took whatever water they can get. In 2022, when I was doing interviews with officials managing the water, they told me, we have no means of cleaning the water. We don't have access to electricity to treat the water. We have no more chemicals. What they were doing, pumping water from the Euphrates and delivering it to those few houses that have access. And then the world was surprised why we had a cholera outbreak. So there's water insecurity. Half of the population is food insecure. They're adopting some strategies to survive that involve skipping meals And there are some families that are picking which member of the family to feed, and you can use your imagination who they are picking. 90% of the population lives in poverty in Syria. Now let's look at the Jordan River very quickly. The Jordan River, by world standards, I love this quote by Miriam Lowy, by world standards, it is a small stream. You can probably cross the Jordan River in the lower points without actually getting wet. But this stream is critical. It is critical for Jordan. It is critical for Syria. It will be critical for Palestine once there's a Palestinian state that has access to it. So the riparians are Lebanon, Syria, Israel, Jordan, and Palestine. For Jordan, it is the only perennial river that is available to it. It has a history of conflicts and cooperation. It's divided in two parts. This is the upper Jordan. This is as it enters the Yarmouk, connects to it, it becomes the lower Jordan. This is predominantly agricultural runoff, right? Because up here at the end of Buhayrat Tabariya, Israel diverts the water in its national water carrier to the rest of its population. It's important to note that Israel has constructed 5 desalination plants, and these plants have allowed it to refill the national water carrier, redirect it to refill Buhayrat Tabariya. Because of the droughts, it was way past depletion. And so the situation kind of changed with the introduction of the desalination capacity. But let's look at the history of bilateral treaties. We have treaties between Syria and Jordan, and we have a treaty over water, part of the peace treaty between Jordan and Israel. For Syria and Jordan, Jordan desperately wanted to build the Wahda Dam in the Yarmouk in order to capture some water. And with every agreement that it reached with Syria, the size of the dam decreased, and Syria secured its right to fill its dams upstream before the water can be used to fill Jordan's dam, the Wahda Dam. As a result, by the time it was built and finished in 2006, the dam had a 100 million cubic meter capacity. Because of upstream construction, it has never been reached to 100 million cubic meters. The highest was 60 in 2013. After that, it has been between 10 to 15 million cubic meters. So as Mark Zaytoun says in his article, and he's right, I want to quote him here, he says, Jordan negotiated both bilateral treaties with Syria and with Israel as a weaker, downstream, militarily weaker riparian. If you look at the peace treaty with Israel, the water sector, so Israel, there's no question, it does comply with those provisions that have been implemented, right? But there have been provisions that have not been implemented. So the lower part of the Jordan River, Jordan is a riparian, it does have right to water. Those storage facilities were never built so that Jordan can have some access to that water. Also, there's a desalination plant for 50 million cubic meters of water that was never built. Fair enough. Israel does give 25%, 25 million cubic meters of water from Buhayrat Tabariya, different quality of water, until the desalination plant is to be built. It has never been built. And then there were supposed to be these bilateral, multilateral projects I'm very happy to talk about later. The Red Sea, Dead Sea project is one of them. So there's Jordan. The population is concentrated in the north. It's very dry. It has about 970 million cubic meters of water available to it domestically, but its demand is well above that because of the influx of refugees. It's projected by 2040 that Jordan will need about 2 billion cubic meters of water. The only amount of water that it has right now domestically is 970 million cubic meters of water. It is trying to build a desalination plant here. Jordan's problem is it has no money. It depends on the international community for money, and the cost of energy to transport the desalination from here, the Dead Sea is the lowest point on earth, up to, high elevations to Amman, to Madaba, to Irbid. It's very costly for Jordan, and it depends on the donor community. Some very quick conclusions. First, the region, all of it, has to improve its efficient use of water. There's a lot of things that can happen in the agriculture sector that I'm very happy to talk about later on that can help us to save this water. Also, the municipal sector, there is There are problems in the distribution system because 50 to 60% of the water in the municipal sector is lost. So it's almost, the problem is a problem of finance. It's a problem of money. It's a problem of policy. It's a problem of politics. It's a problem also of communicating to your people. We need to build better better wastewater treatment plants. We have to communicate with the farmers so that the treated wastewater does not, get placed in the hands of the poor because they don't have the power to reject it as the powerful farmers do. So we need to treat our wastewater to good quality, communicate this knowledge to society, and desalination will have to be part of our future equation. And droughts, we need to have an early warning system. I'm very happy to talk more about this. We know droughts are coming. We know well ahead of time, but we're not communicating it to farmers. We're not giving them a heads up to tell them that we need to shift and change our policy. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Nida. Thank you so much for this very rich intervention. Thanks for taking us to the region and offering us a reality check about many issues, and also for problematizing the different modalities and the different models and what do they tell us and what do they don't tell us. I'm still thinking of that small stream that you talked about and imagining it, if it is that small, what it would do, and what could be the consequences of a larger, bigger stream. And thanks also for ending it with a list of things to do. One additional item that I would like to add to that list is the governance element of all of that, because there are so many issues that we talked about, but also there is a governance one, which is also political, that has very clear consequences, all of that. But we come to that hopefully in the conversation. But swiftly we move from Unida to Muna, and I know that Muna has a lot to say about that area in particular and that region, including her latest book, which I should got from the library here on the Golan Heights. But over to you, Muna, with many thanks. And meanwhile, before maybe you start, Muna, I would like to remind you, dear audience, that you can send your questions and we'll present them shortly. We received a number of them. And also the previous two conversations or interventions are linked to some of our work that we're doing at SIBRI, that it will come in the chat about the Environment of Peace report in particular. Please do check it out, as well as what the civil society can do in all of this equation. Muna, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ala, and thank you to the Arab Center in Washington, D.C. and SIBRI for putting together this great panel and this very timely panel. And I want to thank the excellent speakers already, Karim and Nida, for that really comprehensive overview and kind of really exposing kind of the complexity of addressing, climate change in such a vulnerable region. But I wanted to kind of problematize things even more with a justice lens built into these type of discussions, and kind of really even kind of critiquing and provoking, the systems that we live under that have led us to this catastrophic environmental realities that we are enduring. But before I do that, I wanted to kind of follow up on Tamara's point that maybe this panel is not going to be directly referencing to the ongoing genocide in the besieged Gaza Strip. But I don't really agree, because what's happening in the Gaza Strip is an actual environmental catastrophe. It's a form of ecocide that has been going on in the Gaza Strip that has not only related to an exceptional event or an exceptional form of violence, but it has been, a decades-long process of violence that has been inflicted on Palestinians as part of the Zionist settler colonial project. I wanted to kind of start by a recent report done by The Guardian by Nina Lakhani, and she speaks about the first month of conflict of this genocidal war produced more planet-warming gases than 20 climate-vulnerable nations do in a year, the study shows. And I really wanted to stop here and really think and ponder about, the climate change kind of discourses that we kind of reproduce and speak about when we want to speak about what's happening in our region in the Middle East? Can we speak about climate change as being this very detached, neutral, or natural event that's happening in our region without confronting climate colonialism structures that have made climate change such an existential challenge, especially in our region, in light of these conditions that we live under, climatic conditions. But we also need to make sure that we look at our region as a region the region that has been inflicted with colonialism, and with that colonialism and these post-colonial realities and post-colonial states that were established, that they have reproduced a lot of the very extractivist logic of colonial entities that aim to carry out capitalist accumulation by dispossession, that has also wreaked havoc to our environmental system. So communities in the Middle East indeed are under the threat of climate change. But however, we have to also think of these climatic changes as part and parcel of a process of climatic changes that have been inflicted upon us by colonial structures, by colonial powers that have exploited and have altered completely our region and our connection to our land and resources, and have reproduced nation states that are reproducing the same logic of extractivism. So as Nida quite rightly said, our problem is a problem of mismanagement, decades-long mismanagement of our resources, and only an economic valuation of our resources, rather than thinking of our resources from a plural valuation approach that considered, our connections to that land. So I think also the idea of really abstracting the impacts of climate change can be quite problematic, even in that Guardian idea to kind of maybe showcase to the outside world, and especially Western powers and communities, how effects of climate change can be maybe quantified or materialized in terms of thinking that this ongoing genocidal war can be correlated or compared to 20 countries' emissions in a year. So I think this abstraction is already very problematic, because the besieged Gaza Strip, for example, has been ongoing successive assaults on its infrastructure, on its environment, that has wreaked havoc to it across the different decades and years. So can we also quantify that and think about it in terms of its climate change impact? So these are processes and these are structures that we need to be aware of. I wanted to kind of highlight just a few points around kind of the problematics of this global characterization of climate change and climate change solutions. It's very, very much rooted in a Eurocentric approach and Eurocentric worldview, where we have identified, climate change as a global risk to all of us. So there is a collective need to address this global risk, but without really acknowledging, again, the 10 centuries of exploitation and extractivism that colonialism has caused and continues to cause today through different forms under neoliberal capitalism and under the extractivist economic world order. There is also the idea that global thinking about climate change is based also on very unequal power relations and structures that govern the world we live in today. So even the knowledge we produce today about climate change continues to be very much Western-centric, continues to be very much produced in the English language, that most of our populations around the world do not really, cannot really comprehend and speak with. So we engage with this global world of climate change that is very much, again, centered also on nation-state actors and also on multinational corporations, and not really inclusive of as you mentioned, Ala, very briefly on civil society, also communities themselves who have been at the forefront of addressing climate change for centuries, actually, with a wealth of traditional knowledge and practices that they have at hand. Of course, now the realities of climate change are very much heightened and exacerbated, really, within an existential threat. But we need to also make sure that these structures are addressed and acknowledged when we talk about, especially a region like our region that continues to really suffer under these post-colonial states that can be quite maybe generally characterized as being oppressive regimes that silence dissent, that really have anti-democratic characteristics and really capitalist-driven entities. How can we speak of them as pioneering and championing climate justice, for example, or environmental justice, as Karim mentioned, if they're inherently very undemocratic? And we have also the realities of settler colonialism wreaking havoc in our region, especially against Palestinians, but by the Zionist settler colonial state, but also elsewhere in the region where settler colonialism or iterations of settler colonialism also are taking place. So I think these are really important issues to take into account. Conference of Parties and a lot of these global environmental mechanisms to address climate change have been exposed to be very highly unequal spaces of governance that don't take into account a plurality of valuing nature, and they focus on market-driven, market-based mechanisms and very capitalist understanding of the world. And I think this is really important to highlight in terms of the solutions that all of these mechanisms will provide to us. The current climate change discourses and governance mechanisms also normalize natural resource theft. And I speak about it today from a recent work that I've done with my colleagues on the ecological modernization and the enduring coloniality of ecological modernization in the occupied Syrian Golan Heights, but also in the occupied Western Sahara. So the idea of also finding these very highly vulnerable societies to settler colonialism and resource dispossession being put at the forefront of addressing climate change. So the Western Sahara example, the occupied Western Sahara, is also being promoted and actually actively extracted as a place of green energy transitions, while also the European Union as a main leader and active actor in that process, in addition to the Moroccan government, turning a blind eye also to that these same geographies are geographies where communities are denied the right to sovereignty and the right to also sovereignty over their resources and their right to self-determination. So these new geographies of addressing climate change and combating climate change, because at the end of the day, climate change adaptation and mitigation mechanisms and policies will have to have a material presence in our geographies, and they will also have a material and significant impact and transformation of our connections to the land, of our access to the land. So who wins and who loses in these types of energy transitions that we speak about, especially under these realities of authoritarian and settler colonial regimes. Palestine, of course, remains, a site of environmental extractivism that has not only produced a reality of stark appetite, water appetite, energy appetite, that is not really a natural phenomenon to be addressed by the international aid agencies and mechanisms. It's actually a rights-based and a human right approach that needs to take into account and confront Israel's exploitation of natural resources in Palestine. The climate apartheid we witness in Palestine can be easily and is easily replicated and even seen in different contexts around the region. I really wanted to highlight just quickly about what Nida mentioned around the Jordan River Basin. I have a lot to say, but maybe I'll take it to the Q&A. But I wanted to highlight how as much as the Jordan River Basin is critical, of course, to Jordan, Lebanon, Syria as well. And as you mentioned, to Palestine in the future. The reality and the fact is that the Jordan River Basin has been hoarded by Israel for decades to be. And this is due to also the development of these violent infrastructures like the national water carrier that you have mentioned, that actually diverts waters from the tributaries of the Jordan in other territories in Lebanon and Syria. So that kind of remote also control over what Mark Zaytoun refers to as remote control over our natural resources need to be addressed. There's a territorial issue as well when we talk about addressing climate change, is who controls the resources and who controls the territories that will be used actually to move us towards a just transition. Quickly, also, a lot of course, the green energy and the green colonialism discourses speak about technological advances, technology coming to save the day. Again, these are tropes and ideas that also stem from a very colonial understanding of the world, where technology is seen to be a panacea to address issues that have been arising, as maybe Karim has mentioned in the beginning, from systems that were very exploitative. These systems that were exploitative were not the global South countries. It was actually the global North countries that have blindly exploited and believed in these discourses around development and economic growth, unabated economic growth. So these mechanisms that we have in place are mechanisms that will continue to promote market-based mechanisms like carbon credits and other payments for ecosystem services. These are all ways in which we will address climate change that have been used in different parts of the world to address climate change that are also being implemented in our region. These type of instruments and mechanisms are very much politically neutral, or want to actually not address political issues, which is a very highly problematic approach in a region like our region facing these compounded injustices that I have just highlighted. This brings me to my last point of kind of relating all of this to kind of the realities on the ground. You mentioned, the speakers mentioned refugees and kind of the securitization of the environment. And this is, again, a very real construct that has been shaping climate change discussions. And the idea that climate refugees are a risk to European countries and other countries who want to establish a green energy transition so in order to curb refugee influx into their countries. So we can understand how problematic, racist, and orientalist such approaches and understanding of that energy transitions are. So again, who will speak for these voices in the margin of our society, people that fall outside of this state system? Are internally displaced refugees now being hosted in different countries around the Middle East, particularly Syrian, Iraqi, Palestinian, but also many, many more Sudanese and other refugees that are coming out of genocide warfare. Who will speak of stateless residents in those mechanisms that are basically focused on state actors as the one leading negotiations, designing policies and implementing policies along with international actors and financial mechanisms? Where are the voices of all of these communities? Where are the voices as well that will confront and hold Israel accountable for its decades-long environmental disruption and uprooting of Palestinians from their land, and the ongoing genocide that has forms of ecocide, which also produce, of course, all of these emissions, which is an abstract way to put it. It's also destroying livelihood and destroying Palestinians' future in the land. So I think when we think about climate change, we need to think also about what futures are we bringing up or designing or envisioning for these next generation, like Nida said. How are we thinking about addressing all of these inequalities that are inherently based on systems of extractivism and logic? Last point, really, and I will stop there. We see also these new frontiers of green energy development as well to address climate change, to address this global issue that we want to work together to combat. But this green energy in our region in the Middle East, especially in the Levant, in the Jordan River Basin specifically, it's a site of normalizing relations with the Israeli state, as we see very clearly with the Abraham Accords, but with also other bilateral and multilateral agreements that have been signed between the Palestinian Authority and Jordan and Israel in terms of exchanges of an exchange of water for energy, that Nida also has alluded to in the context of the Jordan River Basin agreements. But also it's actually becoming a kind of a new frontier of an eco-normalization, like Manal has mentioned in this great book that I encourage everyone to read on dismantling green colonialism in the Middle East and in the Arab region. But she spoke of eco-normalization and how these arrangements to address climate change and to move on to green energy transition are really imbued with structural issues of violence, inequality, and dispossession that we really need to be also making sure we confront through different mobilization on multiple fronts, even in that very state-centric fronts of global climate governance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Muna, for all these critical insights and also for the further problematization of the issue. And also thanks for asking all these difficult questions that we need to confront. Who controls? Who speaks on behalf of who will act, who will pay the price, who will sacrifice, but then what kind of futures we will have. So many important questions also to put on the table. But finally, and thanks Aisha for your patience as well. It was really hard as a moderator to stop all these reflections so far. But Aisha, over to you to take us to the Gulf in particular, and what climate justice means for the Gulf region in particular.
Well, thank you very much, Ala, and thanks very much for the speakers as well. I think I have been left with the hard question on what climate justice means for the Gulf, because unlike other Middle East countries, the Gulf countries, although face similar climate challenges in terms of the rise of temperature, water security, and food security, the Gulf are pretty much in a way, the Gulf citizens are, sheltered from the impacts of the climate change. And that is, of course, because of the wealth that comes from the oil and gas. But before going to the question on what does climate justice mean for the Gulf, I think it's good also to remind ourselves that COP28 last year took place in Dubai in the UAE. And it is also good to reflect back on COP28, where the phase out of the fossil fuel, perhaps it is for the first time, have been central to the debate. And the Gulf countries, along with other hydrocarbon producers and major consumers, have really played a critical role on reaching the compromise on the transition away from the fossil fuel and adding the wording that the transition away should happen in a just, orderly, and equitable manner. So on my end, I want to delve a little bit deep on what this just, orderly, equitable manner means for the Gulf countries. And I really believe like the Gulf countries have chosen those wordings in the COP communique. So to do that, I will answer two questions. The first one is why the Gulf countries have really fought hard on reaching this compromise on transition away from the fossil fuel, and also including the wording on the just, orderly, equitable manner. And then what does this just transition mean for the Gulf states in practical terms? So in response to my first question, and before we take a judgmental stance against the Gulf countries, I think it's important, to take a moment and unpack why phasing out fossil fuels is particularly contentious issues for the Gulf countries. And I would really build on what Karim mentioned. So the Gulf countries are at the front line of extreme impacts of the climate change. They are faced by high vulnerability, including the rise in the temperature. The sea level rise is affecting the coastal areas, and they are exposed to extreme weather events like floods, the dust storms. 50 degrees Celsius temperature is becoming a common thing for the region, and the region is heating twice as fast as the rest of the world. Also, the Gulf states rank among the world most 17 water-stressed nations. And all of these factors raise the concerns about the food security, especially the Gulf countries depend between 50 to 90% of their food from the importation. And for the Gulf countries, oil and gas exports are not only central to the economic development, but these resources have helped the Gulf countries to weather those dire impacts of the climate change through the adoption of, air conditioning, cooling systems, using oil money for food import, as well as adopting the desalination technology as well to provide fresh water. So the people in the Gulf have really access to an extent cheap, and almost 99% of the people has access to electricity and water services. So in a way, the people are sheltered. And for the Gulf governments, this, the link between the oil and gas wealth and how that helped the Gulf countries to tackle climate change really present a climate conundrum for the Gulf countries. So this is really explains why the transition away from the fossil fuel and the compromise that has been reached has been really critical for the Gulf countries. Essentially, the measures that are implemented elsewhere to reduce greenhouse gas emissions could possibly mean reducing the consumption for the oil and gas. There are reports that speak about peaking oil demand, and this is a critical issue for the Gulf countries because it means cutting the oil revenues, but also it means that limiting the resources that the Gulf have been using for a long time to cope with the impacts of the climate change. And so this climate conundrum is also explaining why the wording that has been used in the COP28 communique in a way is pretty much vague, and it has different interpretations. In a way, this kind of wording grants a business as usual for fossil fuel producers and does not really mean an end for fossil fuels. This is a win for the fossil fuel producers, but I would argue it is a short-term win, it's not a long-term win, because the more we go into COPs next year, I think the language will become more stringent, and because the climate science and the climate activists will push more for that kind of language. So, so I think also, the wording on the just, orderly, and equitable manner of transition also happens because of that reason. So what does it mean for the Gulf countries in practical terms? So I think I will, disagree with the fact that all of us have, agreed on for a long time. It is when we speak about climate justice, we mainly go back to the idea that climate justice refers to the disproportionate impacts of the climate change, that the countries which have not contributed much to the climate change are the most vulnerable, and they shouldn't really maybe take the responsibility for it. I think if we keep that, in mind, it will help us to widen the divide between the global South and the global North. And it will hold us back from really looking for the solutions and really looking for the opportunities that how tackling climate change, which is impacting all of us in a way or another, it will hold us back on really like seizing the opportunities that are brought by the climate action. For the Gulf countries specifically, and because the Gulf countries have the natural resources, the financial resources, and I would say also to an extent the human resources, I think the first step for the Gulf countries is to shift the mindset from, tapping into this divide between the global North and global South, and really take a proactive approach to reduce the dependence on the fossil fuels, or let's say transition away from the fossil fuels. And this proactive approach, as I mentioned, because of the capability of the Gulf countries, is to develop alternative sources of income, alternative energy resources as well, and to ensure, and I think for Gulf countries specifically, climate justice or just energy is really to ensure that the future generations will enjoy the similar quality of life amid, intensifying impacts of the climate change as the current generations are, enjoying. As I mentioned, citizens of the Gulf have access to cheap electricity, water. So if there's a transition away from the fossil fuel globally and the demand of the oil is going to decline in the future, I think it is the responsibility of the governments today to diversify the economy and create alternative sources of income, as well as figure out the solutions to the major impacts of the climate change. That said, I should also be fair and remember that the compromise for transition away from the fossil fuel took place in the UAE, and the host of the UAE of COP28. I think in a way it is an indicator, a good indicator for the political will from the Gulf leaders to prepare for the oil-free future. And so I think last few points on what are the measures that the Gulf countries can implement to ensure a just climate transition. It's as I mentioned earlier, is to seize the opportunity that are brought by climate action. These opportunities can be, investing in alternative energy resources, and this is really happening, but also to tap into the mineral sector, and also to focus on the innovation, education, continuous learning, and most importantly, to focus on behavioral change. Because as I mentioned, the culture we have vested in, having access to cheap electricity and water. So that needs to be, tackled moving forward. And then, so I will stop here, but I really, I'll be happy to take questions and back these points that I've mentioned.
Thank you very much, Aisha, for all these reflections and additional points to add to the conversation. We have 15 minutes and we already received so many questions, and I will not dare to ask my questions in this case. But maybe I try to take the questions in two goes. Coming back to you, Karim, there's a question from Johan Shar, who's actually a SIBRI associate with the Middle East program. And Johan asks, going back to your questions, and sorry, I'm trying to paraphrase, going back to the link with the migration. And Johan says that maybe we should be a bit skeptical about that because migration researchers, for example, don't point out to that, because those least likely to migrate, Johan say, are those most vulnerable to climate change impacts as they lack the resources to do so. However, we need to understand better the complex migration movements to and from within the MENA region, including refugees and IDPs, as they are likely to be impacted by the climate change. Any thoughts on that? Any thoughts on the issue? And maybe also Mona, we talked, and this is a question from Anne. We talked a lot about environmental injustice, but what does a realistic environmental justice look like? And what is required to achieve this, to include citizens holding their own governments accountable for the continuing injustice imposed on the population? Thanks, Anne, for asking this. Karim, over to you, and then Mona.
Sure. So I think it's a great question. I think what the researchers have poured cold water on is the idea that the displacement would happen and would lead to mass migration towards Europe. What we had seen is more internal displacement, people moving within the same country, perhaps to neighboring countries, but not necessarily moving to Germany. And I think that counts as migration, and I think it counts as displacement, and I think it's a real risk for the region. So pointing out that it will lead to climate refugees, climate migrants, the definition of these terms hasn't been agreed yet, is certainly there. What we are not sure about is where would they go? And what kind of resources are available to them, which direction would be available. But the Eurocentricity that assumes that this is an issue for Europe, I think is misplaced here, because we were talking about the general issue of displacement as a result of climate impacts and its nexus with conflict.
Mona, thanks, Karim.
Yeah, thanks to Anne. This is a really important question, because I think once we also speak of kind of structural issues, we need to also kind of think of like how to confront them, because it's such an overwhelming as well. Because it does require system change. It doesn't require just fixing the system from within or trying to find manipulations to addressing issues of injustice. So I think, yes, it is. It's very highly context specific, and it's very highly dependent on how and what we include in environmental justice. Are we talking about a distributive type of justice, or we're talking about also other iterations and approaches to understanding justice, such as recognition justice? And then there is a lot to actually unpack there. But I think what's really important is that it's a highly a very critical aspect of tackling climate change in our region specifically, if we don't speak of the systematic environmental injustice that all of our communities, whether, as I mentioned, living under different regimes and also different failed states and other settler colonial realities, is that we really need to make sure to put justice understandings and justice-centered approaches at the forefront, and not just kind of rely on top-down approaches and understanding of, how to address climate change, which is really happening today. It's very much states are kind of changing their discourses and changing their position to meet the requirements for accessing financial funds to address climate change. And this is kind of a vicious cycle that really lacks accountability, lacks addressing, very justice-centered questions and issues that are facing communities across different scales in our region. So we need to find solutions. They need to come also from a very much principled grassroots movement that stems from the decades-long and generational civil society struggles that have been also going all around the world, from North Africa to Palestine and Mashriq in general and elsewhere. So it's an intersectional struggle that needs to be addressed in that way.
Thank you, Mona. Nida and Aisha, I have a couple of questions for you. One from Aida, and Aida asked, what are the incentives that some Arab and Middle East countries get when they get involved in climate change forums and agreements? And the second question related also to that, it's an emailed question that is, industrialization came late to the global south, and now that they are reaping the economic rewards, Europe and US are asking the global south to curb emissions. Would you include that under environmental injustice? And a final question is about foreign governments, and this is from William. Are foreign governments and global corporations responsible for climate injustice in the Middle East, or is it poor/corrupt environmental policy by MENA regimes? Nida, and then Aisha.
Okay, so maybe I can answer. There's an element of governance in every single one of them, and how responsible are the governments themselves? Certainly, the governments have mismanaged the water. There's no question about that. And at the same time, water is part of the responsibility of the government to give to its citizens. So part of this social contract, if you will, and Aisha touched upon it, part of the social contract is you give your citizens utilities. You give them electricity, you give them water, you give them food. That's kind of the social contract. You give me these things at a low price, and then in return, I will give you legitimacy, right? In my eyes, and I will not overthrow you. So it's an integral part of effective governance. And in the case of Jordan, they're miserably failing. And I think the regime at this point realizes that, but it doesn't have the resources to address it. And it's highly dependent on loans and foreign aid. And so there's a role here for the donor community not being as effective in providing and providing the resource in a means that they understand the social situation in the country. So they come in, they give aid, they develop a project without understanding that this project really needs an institution. It needs communication with society. It needs a way to allow the project to continue to survive after the funding is done, right? So you get these small cherry picking of projects that don't get us anywhere. And for the government, I think the government is short-sighted. They're trying to survive this summer and not really taking into account what's going to happen down the road. They've been doing that for the last 15 years, and I'm hoping that they are realizing the need to adapt to climate change, hence the push to try to build this desalination plant. So yes, ineffective government. Yes, it's highly politicized. Yes, it's short-term, very short-sighted policies. But with the droughts, with the discontent in society, I see hope for change.
With that, Aisha, over to you with the hope for change.
Thank you. So yes, on the incentives for Egypt or really any government, I think the incentive is to look around and see how the country is impacted by the climate change. And I think this support that is provided by the global community, it is an opportunity to tap into the financial and the technical resources that are available. But I think when the question came, the issue is always is about like the human capacity and how to kind of put together a report, a transparent report on what the country needs in terms of the support, and how to actually really avoid the greenwashing, like asking for money but using the money for something else, because this happened in the past. So I think this is one of the issues that the international support trying to avoid. And on the second question, again, it goes back to the divide between the global north and the global south. So I am with the climate science. I am that with the idea that all of us are impacted of the climate change. And I have attended a couple of the COP meetings. And this, the blaming and shaming has been going on since the start of the UNFCCC, since 1992. And I think we should altogether pass that point, because during the COP meetings, the discussion is about, yes, it really acknowledged that the global north should take the responsibility about, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and also provide the financial support for the developing countries to be able to catch up with the developed countries in terms of addressing climate change and in terms of the energy transition. I think as we speak today, climate change is an issue of emergency, and we really should think more about the solutions and how we can work together. So if I am a developing country, I should identify what is the real issue that I'm facing and what sort of support that I need. I think we should do more of this moving forward.
We ran out of time, but I want to take 30 seconds each, if you don't mind, and starting with you, Aisha, here in reverse order, by asking what is the key prerequisite to achieve environmental justice? One thing, one element that we should really invest in it, and we should really focus from your perspective to ensure environmental justice in 30 seconds or
Yes.
20.
I think I will say it in one word: education and awareness. It's the right of the people of today and the future to be aware of the impacts of the climate change and then think about the solution.
And Nida, what is your prerequisite? You're muted, sorry. Until education and awareness from Aisha.
Okay, so for me, it would be investing in rural areas. They are the ones that are most vulnerable. They're the ones that are going to suffer the most, and they're the ones with the least capacity to adapt, the least resilience. And I think the governments need to really be in touch with rural areas, communicate, and be more effective in their policies.
Thank you, Nida. And Karim.
I would echo something similar to what Nida said. I think being aware of the impacts of climate change might not necessarily be enough. And I think you need to develop the adaptive capacity, the societal and economic capacity to adapt to those changes, both in terms of the impacts of climate change on us, but also our responses to that climate change, which includes energy transition. So developing those economic sectors and giving them this ability to adapt to this new world, this world where you're not dependent on fossil fuels, but perhaps more renewables, this world where agriculture and tourism will have to adapt in order to stay afloat. I think this would be the key thing to invest in for a more just environment.
Thank you all. I mean, there are very important. These are very important prerequisites to leave with, and I'm leaving this panel with them. How we can focus on education and awareness to make us closer to environmental justice. How we can invest in rural areas. How we can invest in adaptive capacities, and I'm sure Mona will add how we can address the political roots of the issues and that lead to this crisis and the injustice in the first place. Thank you all for all the questions, and thank you for all the audience for the questions that you asked. And I'm sorry if we didn't manage to cover all of them. This has been extremely rich and inspiring conversation, although you highlighted many difficult issues and offered multiple reality checks that needs to be tackled in order to address climate change and environmental justice in the region. This is definitely a conversation to be continued and actions to be taken, especially focusing on the pathways forwards by being embedded first in the context that matters to produce knowledge that matters and then have policy impact to create positive change. On that, I would like to thank you all, dear distinguished speakers, for being with us and for this very rich conversation and discussion. And dear audience, thank you so much for all your engagement. And on behalf of both the Arab Center DC as well as SIBRI, we would like to thank you for being here today. And this is a conversation to be continued.